Angelia, and today I'm going to be showing you how to sew this Cowl Neck Cami. I am going to be showing you guys how to drape it as well as sew it. But if you can't be bothered to learn how to drape this bodice, or if you don't have a mannequin or anything, that's okay because I have a full pattern with instructions in my website. I'm gonna link it down below, and all you have to do is skip to this time right here to go straight into the sewing instructions. Also note, I did record many versions of me sewing this top, so if the color of the top changed anytime during this tutorial, that's just me trying to record as many angles as possible so that it's easy for you guys to understand what I'm doing. So that's all I have to say for now. Let's skip right into the tutorial. Okay, so to start, this is the list of things that you're going to need to drape. So to start this tutorial, I'm going to need to start with a clean and fresh mannequin. So I'm just removing all of my old style tape. Next, I'm going to use my measuring tape to map out where I want my straps to be and how long I want to be. You can definitely play around with the measurements. It's totally up to you. I already knew that I wanted my straps to be about 10 inches apart at the front and 4 inches long from the high point shoulders. This part is optional, but I use some style tape to draw out where my straps are going to be. I think it helps me visualize the top a little bit better. Now it's time to prep the muslin. So you're going to need about a 30 by 30 inch square of muslin. Depending on the size of your mannequin, you might need to go bigger. After the muslin is cut into the correct size, you're going to want to make sure that everything is balanced and it's perfect square. Sometimes when you rip muslin, it gets a little bit warped, so you're just going to want to tug the edges a little bit and mold it into a perfect 90-degree square. Then we're going to fold it diagonally and make sure that the edges line up perfectly. Again, tugging and molding the edges to make sure that all the edges line up. Next, we're going to get some basting thread and we're just going to baste that diagonal line that we just made. Next, we're going to unfold the square and we're going to measure out a 10-inch mark where we're going to fold like so, and then baste as well. After everything's basted and prepped, this is how everything should look. So to start the drape, you're going to want to keep the 10-inch line folded, and you're going to line up the center front line with the longer diagonal base that you did. You're going to pin down the muslin at the strap points that you marked before, leaving some ease in the middle to form the cowl shape. This is where you really get to play around with the drape and see how low you want your cowl to go. Just make sure that your center front basted line is perfectly perpendicular to the floor while you're draping. This will ensure that you'll be draping on the exact bias, which will help with the overall fit of the top in the end. Once you're happy with the shape of your cowl, you're going to move on to the side. We're going to pin down the armhole. It should drop about an inch below where the armhole plate is on the mannequin. Then we're going to smooth out the side seam and pin that down as well, making sure that your center front is straight. After everything's pinned down, we can start marking everything with pencil, making a dash line at where you want your front strap point to be, and then dotting the shape of the armhole. Where the armhole meets the side seam, you're going to draw a cross mark, then dotting the side seam the rest of the way through and adding another cross mark at the waist point. Once everything's marked, we can take it off the mannequin. Also note, we're only marking half of the muslin for now. We're going to copy the other half when it's on the table. Next, you're going to fold the muslin in half at the center front basted point. we're going to start truing in all the lines, only on half the muslin for now. I'm marking out all of my cross marks so that it's easy to see. I'm going to be making a straight line under the armhole about 1/2 inch in, and then blending the rest of the armhole in with a French curve. Next, we will be truing in the side seam with a hip curve, making sure that all the dots that you marked before are blended smoothly. I'm going to use a straight ruler next to mark out my seam allowance, which is about 1/2 inch at the side seam. And 1/2 inch at the armhole. Then we're going to bring out our wax tracing paper and transfer everything onto the other side with the tracing wheel. Don't forget to mark out your notches, and this is what the other side's going to look like. After everything is marked out onto the other side, we're going to trim off the excess muslin at the seam allowance. So this is what your final drape should look like. We're going to put everything back onto the mannequin just to make sure that everything's where it's supposed to be. We also want to make sure that our cowl drape is balanced and even. And then once we're happy with the look of it, we can start making the paper pattern version. So to start the pattern, you're going to want to cut out a piece of pattern paper wide enough to fit your muslin. Sorry, I somehow managed to lose the footage for this, but here's an overview so you can get the gist of it. I folded the paper in half and used the tracing wheel to trace out all the lines that I marked before on my muslin, and then you're going to use the pencil to true everything out. At this point, you also want to determine the length of your garment and then draw in your hemline. Next, we're going to move on to the facing. I didn't add enough space on my pattern before, but I fixed that after. You're going to fold the pattern at the top cowl line that we had marked before and cut off any excess pattern paper at the bottom. Next, we're going to transfer all the information from the armhole and the side seam onto the facing. This facing is called the self facing, which means that it's attached to the main body of the top itself, so that means it doesn't need to be cut out as a separate piece, it just needs to be folded over and stitched together. In the end, I ended up making my facing about 7 inches long with 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now we're going to be moving on to the back. Since the top has a front cowl neck, the pattern is going to be a lot wider at the front top opening versus the back top opening. So to do that, we're going to pin the sweep in place at the center front and then shift the center front line over until we reach the measurement we want for the back top opening. I ended up making mine about 15.5 inches wide. Next, I'm going to be using a tracing wheel to transfer all of the lines into the back pattern, making sure to mark all of my notches along the way as well. And then truing everything again with a pencil. Note that the back top opening line connects to the underarm hole point of the front pattern, so that'll just be a straight line from underarm to center back. Again, giving everything a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Last but not least, we're going to be cutting out our pattern pieces. And then making sure to correctly label everything for easier reference in the future. So this is how your final pattern should look. So to start constructing this top, you're going to need this list of things. So for fabric, I recommend anything lightweight and drapey like charmeuse or georgette. I also recommend using scrap paper or leftover wrapping paper underneath to keep the fabric from sliding too much when cutting. So to place the pattern pieces, you're going to want to make sure that your center lines are all perpendicular to the selvage of the fabric. And then you can either pin or weigh down the patterns before cutting them out. Don't forget to mark your notches while cutting as well. The next thing you're going to want to do is cut out 3 bias strips 1/4 inch wide and at least 30 inches long each. You can also skip this step by buying a 1/2 inch single folded bias tape in a similar color as your main fabric. I didn't have that on hand, so I just made my own bias strips. Next, you're going to press your bias strips in half. Make sure not to pull it too hard when pressing or else it'll get too stretched out. This is what it should look like after the first press. Then you're going to press it one more time by folding the edges towards the middle. This is what your bias strip should look like at the end. So to start sewing, we're going to start with a hem on the bottom of the facing with a 1/4 inch turn back top stitch. I recommend making a 1/4 inch stay stitch at the bottom before hemming to prevent the facing from stretching out. You can also use a seam ripper like I did to help tuck in the edges when sewing. This is what the hem should look like. Next, we're going to fold the facing onto the top, wrong side facing together. We're going to sew the facing onto the top with a 1/4 inch stay stitch at the armhole and the side seam. Next, we're going to line up the bias strip that we ironed before flat along the armhole, right side facing together. You're going to want to sew in the middle of the ditch that I'm pointing out right here. This is what it should look like after sewing in the middle of the ditch on the bias strip. Next, you're going to fold the bias strip in half and sew all the seam allowance to it with an understitch. This is what it should look like after the understitch is done. And then we're going to fold the bias strip one more time again towards the wrong side of the fabric and then sew a 1/4 inch top stitch all around. You're going to continue that top stitch to the rest of the bias strip by folding it in half and then edge stitching. This will form the spaghetti strap for the top. This is what the armhole and the strap should look like in the end. The front should only show the 1/4 inch top stitch and the back should only show the bias strip folded over and tacked down. Next, we're going to trim down our strap to our desired length. I made mine 12 inches. I also have a full size chart included in the instructions manual with my free pattern. You're going to lay down the straps at your back notch marks, making sure that they're not twisted, and then tack them down. After the straps are tacked down, you're going to repeat the same steps that you did for the armhole to the back top opening with your third piece of bias strip. And then when all of that is done, you're going to trim off any excess bias strips, and you're going to finish off the side seams a 1/2 inch. I don't have a serger, but if I did, I would serge the extra seam allowance off and press the seam allowance open. But if you're like me and you don't have a serger, you can finish off the seams with a 1/4 inch French seam, which is basically sewing the fabric together, right sides facing out a 1/4 inch, and then trimming off the extra seam allowance, then flipping it over, and then giving it another 1/4 inch straight stitch. After that, I would press all the seam allowance towards the back of the top. Last thing you're going to want to stitch is the hem with another 1/4 inch turn back top stitch. Now to finish everything off, give everything a good press. And we are done. So this is the final look, and you can make it in many different colors and many different fabrics. And I wanted to show you guys how I would style these tops. The end of the tutorial. I hope you guys like it. I will talk to you guys next time.